Hi everyone, welcome back to Interact Global. I'd like to say a huge thanks to Emily Trotter for her talk on the science of illustration and experience design this morning. Coming up this afternoon, straight after this talk at a slightly earlier time than usual of 2 p.m, we've got Liz Hubert and Diana Sonif of CX by Design with their talk, Forget the Trail of Breadcrumbs. Up now though, we have Lisa Reeves, User Experience Domain Lead for New Propositions at HSBC, with her talk, Agile UX and the Design Thinking Model. In this talk, Lisa will discuss how designing new propositions for banking by leveraging the stages of the design thinking model within an agile working environment across teams has been working at HSBC to create value for their customers and business. As always, please do get involved in the chat with the discussion. Make sure your chat settings are switched to panelists and attendees, and that way everyone can see your messages. And do let us know if there's any issues with audio or the stream or anything like that there too. If there is, we'll get that sorted ASAP for you. Please submit your questions for Lisa using the Q&A box. I'll get through as many as I can at the end. And finally, we're using auto-generated captions. So just do bear with us if they get a little muddled live. When we add this to our YouTube channel, we'll make sure they're all tidied up. So yeah, over to you, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Henry. And thanks, Namanta, for having me. I will try and speak as clearly as possible for the auto-generated captions. I think that's a great touch. But I do know, like with the back end of the cold that I've had recently, I can probably sound a bit clunky. So bear with me. Apologies for that. Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about Agile UX, user experience, and the concept of the design thinking model that a lot of designers might be aware of on this session already. And if you're not, don't worry, I'm going to talk a little bit about it soon. But first, a little bit about myself. I am a designer by trade. I'm currently at HSBC. I lead the domain of new propositions, which is sort of basically the very new propositions and solutions that the HSBC is exploring and rolling out globally in various different countries. But previous to that, I've spent a little time in tech and finance at places like Adobe and Barclays. And before that, I actually cut my teeth in e-commerce, before sort of the concept of UX was really, a big thing and a well-known concept. It was sort of more just around sort of web experience, web design, maybe a bit of mobile. So that's sort of where I've come from. Excuse me. So yeah, on to design thinking. What is the design thinking model? Well, it's an approach to problem solving that's very specific to design, and it involves assessing known aspects of a particular problem that customers might have, and understanding what those users are sort of thinking about, what motivates them, what fears or challenges they might have, as well as sort of turning the concept on its head and actually challenging the assumptions that a business might have. So if you're a design team, or if you're maybe sort of an agency, you might be used to sort of seeing a business come to you with an idea or a concept, and you want to be able to challenge that and make sure that it's right for the customer. And it really helps redefine those problems and create the right solutions to test. And it's really important to remember that although when you're sort of learning about the DT model, the design thinking model, in these various different steps, being able to empathize with customers, define what the problem might be, ideate, and so on, it's actually quite a non-linear process. So you end up sort of cycling back and cycling through this creative set of stages, really. But it's really crucial to remember that for us to develop and refine our skills, we can understand and address our users' environments and our behaviors so much more rapidly. And at the moment, there are two main streams of mainstream models of design thinking. The first here is the Stanford Design School, where it simply breaks down those stages that I mentioned. And also sort of based in the UK, we also have the Design Council that came up with being able to take those same 5 stages and wrap them around a concept of divergent and convergent thinking. So you really sort of break apart a particular problem and then bring it back as you start to ideate into this double diamond framework that they call it. But put simply, both of them, doesn't matter how you end up using them, encourage organizations to put their customer first and create a human-centered mindset for any teams that are working in that particular framework. And that's kind of where we are today. This is why it's important to talk about it. The design thinking model at HSBC, this is what it looks like. Just move my cursor away. We take both of those, the best of both of those particular models that I've mentioned, and you can see how they really fit together. And we like to sort of be able to promote that divergent way of thinking, convergent thought processes too. But additionally to that as well, we like to add a mobilization phase at the beginning, which makes sure that we can sort of set up for success really and establish really clearly defined problem statements and make sure that the group that's involved in a particular project is aware of the scope of the project they're working on. So everybody's sort of starting off with the same footing, which is often quite helpful. And then the last two stages that we add are around continuous improvement, being able to test with real users, maybe in a live environment. How do you review, assess and optimize what you've put out there, which is quite helpful. And as a consequence, excuse me, we're able to get products to market 6 times faster. And the solutions are so much more sort of better and well structured for our customers and for the business too. And it really is a mindset as much as a process. And I'll go into that in more detail. So Agile by comparison. So a little bit about that. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. I think I can admit I spent a lot of time in my early career working in agile environments, but without really grasping what the methodology holistically meant for me, for design, for the whole end-to-end process. I was just a small part of a small process, part of a small piece of that, looking at this tiny section. And what agile with a capital A really was, we all just sort of nodded and just sort of carried on. So I want to just spend a tiny bit of time talking about it. And it's described as also an iterative approach, but to project management and to software development. And it helps teams develop, deliver value to customers with just fewer headaches and a fast, continuous, rapid process. So you're already starting to see some of the similarities between the two models or two methods. It was set up it came to life, I suppose, about 20 years ago now. A bunch of developers wanted to work out how they could speed up development in order to bring new software to market faster. And they realized there were two opportunities that would help them achieve this goal. They could shorten the delay of the rollouts of their features and their benefits to their users straight into live. And they could also get as much feedback very quickly as possible from those live users to confirm the usefulness, to confirm the success of the software that they were developing, and then just continue that cycle of iteration. It's really strong. So instead of this big launch where you just roll everything out in one go, the idea was that a team could develop small, chunky, consumable increments of experience to their customers or the consumers. And the Agile methodology kind of comes with these 12 guidelines called the Manifesto, Agile Manifesto, and it enables the right mindset. So as a designer, I didn't actually read these until quite later on. And it was really interesting to see how certain projects was really set up for success because they applied these quite nicely, or where they included sort of design teams in the process and were able to spread this culture and spread this set of tenets, which is very interesting. And I'll go through my slides, you'll see some in the top right-hand corner, how they sort of relate backwards and forwards to some of the design thinking learns that I'm going to share with you. But how does it look together? Well, you can see both processes clearly iterative, and they feed themselves in terms of process and delivery. And theoretically, they match quite well. There's no clear empathy stage in Agile, where the designers obviously like to put themselves in the shoe of the consumer or the customer first. Agile depends on measuring the success and getting the feedback from something live. And here there's a little gap by prototyping. Designers and developers sometimes work together, they test and they prototype at that stage, and it depends on the shape of the team and the skill sets available as to how that sort of overlaps and sort of fits together. But all in all, there are more matches than not, and it's really powerful to be able to bring tech, design and product and business all together in this same iterative process. Okay, so enough about those two. Where did we use this? So I worked on a brand called Kinetic for a little while at HSBC. It's a new digital banking proposition for small business owners based in the UK, for single directors and sole traders at the moment to start with. And from the inside, the ways of working, sort of think of it more as a startup, but with the power of a big bank behind it. And we were really privileged, really, to work a little outside of those HSBC sort of remits. And they encouraged us to sort of set up independently. And that really helped the agile process work. Excuse me. Our teams were made up of product owners, business analysts, allocated developers, all independent, so they didn't have to work elsewhere. They were just committed to Kinetic. And obviously as well, they had their own design team working with the DT model, design thinking model. And it worked really well, generally speaking. Cadence worked really well across the different functions in the teams. And Agile really helped solve and build those new customer journeys incrementally. And we were working really well at pace. Even as COVID actually kicked in, we were able to pivot extremely well and respond a lot faster than some of the banking teams out there in the UK today. And the core banking teams within HSBC really started to take notice. And there were a lot of learns there, which was really good because we knew that we were onto something quite vibrant, really productive way of working, which was good. But sometimes it would feel a little bit like this. As with all things, it wasn't really perfect. Certain pressures sometimes took hold. Sometimes it was a bit tough. Remote working proved useful sometimes, but obviously often worked up some points of friction on occasion. And here you can swap out extreme programming for designing or developing or for any part of the creative process, really, even if this comic is nearly 20 years old as well. And it could get a bit much for some of the teams. And so it was actually really important to sort of iterate on ourselves and our processes, which sounds like common sense. But interestingly, I've worked in a lot of places that didn't provide that structure or had just forgotten the whole concept of common sense. So sort of behind this, what was actually happening? Well, as Kinetic kind of took off and the wider bank started to notice, and it became more and more important to commit to certain milestones, pivot occasionally. Something was always going to give. We had a very tightly run ship, and it was most excellent. Everybody was working really, really well together. But as pressure generally has that effect, some designers started to feel like there wasn't enough time to carry out the due diligence on what they do. And they wanted to do what they do well and take pride in their work. There was the concern that that wasn't quite happening so much, or was consistently. So questions started to arise, obviously within the design community. Were we really adhering to the DT model? What if our designs were not customer-centric enough? Potentially these sort of concerns, worries, anxieties. It wasn't matter of fact. It was more just, are we really improving continuously on what we're putting out there? When or where is day two? That fast follow commitment? Are we actually, working in a way that actually sort of fits to that agile space? What's being built and developed by developers, was that actually what was designed? Little things like this at various different stages of this whole iterative development and design process. So it was clear, without the proper attention, as we started to work at pace and really sort of heads down into the work, the two mindsets, the two frameworks could start to peel away from each other a little bit, and both being lesser for not having the other half there potentially. So with that in mind, I wanted to share a few lessons about what we learned to keep, or we're trying to sort of keep the DT model and Agile working in sync together. So firstly, maintaining your relationships. So I am coming to this from a design team perspective, from a designer's perspective, but every designer should feel enabled and confident to build and maintain balanced relationships with their stakeholders, their product teams, their developers. Sometimes there are occasions when designers wouldn't understand where particular requirements might have come from. Likely, those requirements were valid, and we just weren't part of the initial conversation. For whatever reason, time became quite precious, especially sort of during the early stages of COVID, when we were trying to sort of rework certain ways of working potentially. So to avoid repetition of conversations, it became quite clear that having a designer present at those initial kickoffs really needed to happen. That's sort of one of the core tenets, and it establishes that customer mindset from the start. It also avoids conversations at the other end, where without all of the correct information, the conversations around risk or compliance or particular technical limitations that you might have within the app or within your experience, the wrong thing might have been designed. You're sort of wasting time there, which kind of connects quite nicely to that agile principle, or the part of the manifesto, principle number 4, that business people, developers, designers must work together daily throughout a project. So it's about making sure that those connections and those relationships are really tight. There was a phase when some of the design squads didn't really have access to some of the new remote stand-ups or reviews of builds. And although it's not important to attend every single one, it is important to have access to them and to be able to show up and be part of that team and represent design and the customer. However, occasionally it's quite important. And likewise, designers and developers working on that front-end experience at the coalface, so to speak, the designers were really keen to support as sprints progressed, but didn't want to wait until the last minute to find something hadn't quite been built correctly or developed correctly, or the design didn't function in the right way, but it was too late to tweak it. So these continuous touch points really help, especially with everything being relatively remote now. We've lost that, I'll just wander over to Sheila's desk and ask a few questions, where we need to make sure that those connections and make more of the effort about those connections between our team members across functions really work and are sustainable. And to that point, we as designers are very good at facilitating co-creation exercises and sessions, and they really help open up those relationships and promote sort of transparency and clarity to avoid miscommunications or time wasted effectively. So moving on, research. It really doesn't matter what kind of framework you're working to. If you're building something for someone else, you're going to want their input and that insight without question. Research, unfortunately, though, is one of those stages that potentially gets dropped pretty quickly under stress, under pressure in a business. And the downside of that, sort of thinking sort of holistically and strategically, it actually just produces quite a lot of anxiety for a design team. If it's not handled correctly, that concern, that anxiety, I've seen design teams just sort of slowly dissipate away because they don't understand the value of which they're creating. They have no customer, user, consumer feedback, and potentially they sort of start to check out and could move on to other roles because they don't feel the value that they're inputting. So now we're sort of moving into this broader culture, team environment where empathy and part of the design thinking model actually kind of powers the way in which designers do their work and enjoy their work. So in our agile environment, it was really important to make sure that all teams had access to live data that was coming back from the app from our live customers. We might not have had the time during our sort of tight sprint processes to do full-on research exercises or studies, but actually there was quite a lot of data and insight that was already there. That didn't cost any extra. It was just about connecting teams up to the right people to be able to see that coming through from dashboards and things like that, to be able to see how users were behaving, what type of customers did we actually have, drop-offs, were there particular screens or pages that weren't really performing as well as expected. We even had voice of the customer working groups, which was quite nice, and to be able to attend those as a design team, really gave us a lot of insight. And this was all part and parcel of the agile process that was already in play and working. So it wasn't any additional effort for anybody. It was just about getting access to that. And that's a really good place to start. It's a lot of insight to start with, which was really, really beneficial. It was quite funny actually, because I remember sitting, was a previous bank role. I realized sort of halfway through my time there, or towards the end of my time there actually, the design team sat right next to an analytics team, an Adobe analytics team. And never once as a designer did I get any insight from them, or did I realize that I could reach out to them and find out about particular ways in which the app that we were creating was working, which was it was an awful shame, quite a waste really. Perhaps it wasn't deemed important for what we were creating. Perhaps that information was going into packs elsewhere within the business. But for designers to actually look at live data coming in from an app, especially if you're iterating and publishing builds, quite often it's quite nice to be able to sort of connect and actually use that information too. On top of this, when you do have the opportunity to research ahead of live or sort of live publication, it doesn't have to be like a full 8-week external agency supported, really expensive end-to-end testing. If you've got the time and the money, great, and the commitment, that's brilliant. But you can build on what you already have. Remote accessibility testing has actually come a long way, and literally in the last year, obviously because people have had to turn to remote testing whilst being at home. We have surveys from existing customers, potential customers, and that really helps increase the value of the experience being delivered in an incremental way. And so most importantly, kind of boils down to this point in terms of research from a DT model in an agile space. If you can aim towards the cadence of research that synchronizes with your sprints, or the sprints that are being defined in your agile environment, then everybody gets used to the presence of insights being part of that overall journey. And then there becomes this sort of interaction and dependency on those insights that comes through in every sprint. And that goes for business analysts, product owners, other stakeholders, as well as the design team. Everybody can sort of work on those together. And as designers, we should feel kind of like subject matter experts in research, unless you have a research arm or a research team or a singular research bod, which is great. But if you don't, within your small agile teams, we should feel as designers that we can take a little ownership around that, being able to sort of preach that customer voice and encourage it where possible, and also educate the teams on research, different types of research where it might be relevant, and have those open discussions, because they might just not know. We had an interesting conversation around just a simple sort of question: why is this particular prototype just full of grey boxes? What are we going to learn from this? And you sort of start to realize that your wider team in that agile space might not have the same amount of knowledge or experience that you as a designer might have experienced. So it's good to bring people along on that journey. So that brings me on to housekeeping. Kind of similar to the topic of cadence. This is sort of a wider piece around this, I suppose. It sounds boring, but the fundamental basics to establish the ways of working that mean a phase of design or development doesn't get overwhelmed or squashed, like in that sort of agile process, really does depend on good housekeeping. The basic admin, so that people understand how you work as a design team in an agile environment, and how agile works within the design community. Agile has a really structured process with all of its ceremonies, and to work inside it, it's good to have bear some sort of reflection or commitment to those. So the Kinetic design team actually decided to have its own stand-ups every day, where we could explain what we're working on, highlight any particular issues, make other designers aware. And that was really helpful because it kind of set us up in that same sort of mindset for agile. We might not story point everything, but there's some form of metric that allows us to communicate how long something might take, or how short something might take, or what the dependencies might be. And that's really valuable. What's also really valuable is the access to the product roadmap. The team are able to look ahead, even though it's subject to change, which is fine. Change is a good thing. Even though it's subject to change, we can look ahead and consider research ahead of time, which means we can start sort of planning with that cadence, possibly even more way ahead if we want to do a longer piece of research about particular propositions or new features that we might be looking ahead of next year. And plan accordingly, very, very helpful. On housekeeping also, I get asked a lot about the process of briefing. Another story from a previous role, I remember I was a junior, and this lead designer, this VP, design principal, had created this incredibly well-structured briefing template for all requests coming into the design team, which was about 30, 40 strong. It captured absolutely everything, business objectives, what was the customer motivation, had there been any CX research committed to it, was there any user testing that was going to be required, due dates, whole shebang. And he presented this to his team, and his words were, as he was showing us this: if they can't fill it out, we don't do the design. And that was pretty much it, which sounded great and powerful, as a lead designer talking to a bunch of juniors and middleweights. But in retrospect, it's not really that functional. And I observed what sort of happened. You get your escalations, you get your political fights, perpetual toxicity, really, zero production, zero creativity. So I learned from that, and briefs need to carry requirements, but they need to work for both parties. An example for this was that Kinetic has its own marketing team, sort of within its own environment, and the design team support on artworking or visual designs. Although our primary focus was obviously the UX and the UI of the app, it's good to consider the customer experience holistically across multiple platforms, all of the touch points that customers might approach Kinetic on. And there was a bit of a lack of understanding around how delivery times should work, what was required of a designer to create a particular email template, perhaps, how did sign-off work for non-app related designs, particular other teams that needed to be involved in that, the route of copy, which was going to be slightly more lengthy rather than micro copy in UX. So we've been working with a team to actually create an effective marketing brief, a template that supports just a different set of dynamics, really. And that's been incredibly helpful. So it's not about just refusing something because they haven't ticked all of the boxes. It's about having an open discussion and inviting them along on that journey with you. So yeah, that's that. I think exceptional designers, one thing to bear in mind, I think exceptional designers generally want the best, and sometimes perfection isn't possible. But to be able to support on an iterative process and actually tweak that mindset is really, really beneficial. So we try to record our defects and record our successes as well, which allows us to circle back to them and call out what might be impactful later on. So that's the final point around housekeeping in an agile environment. Finally, iterative support. The iterative process, it's something to support and encourage, I'd say, sort of at every stage, not just sort of within what you're building for your customer or your consumer, but actually within your own environment and yourselves as well. All of these sticky issues that I've mentioned so far, if not dealt with properly, can result in a severe breakdown. As I said, designers might check out depending on sort of their own mindset. Development might be quite overwhelmed, your work's not up to scratch, and your customer experience is effectively taking a hit. So design teams in large scale organizations tend to be part of a design hub, and they're outsourced to another team working in the agile environment. So if anything, iteration should be included as regular check-ins with the design team, but also the agile team needs to connect properly with those designers and vice versa. It goes back to kind of having, those established relationships, but a space where everybody's really comfortable in sharing pain points and blockers. And it's all for the sake of clarity, really. And if there are any issues, excuse me, if there are any issues, then there should be really clear lines of escalation through those teams or how those teams work. So you never get to a point where anybody feels burnt out or product teams are barking up the wrong tree or down the wrong path, whatever the phrase is. And it's about being able to iterate on those. So having retros within those teams, retrospectives, where you can understand how things have worked and what could work better next time, really, really helpful. And again, it's taking that agile mindset, putting it into the design team and thinking about that holistically. So those are my 4 points, I suppose, or areas of learns that, excuse me, that I wanted to share about Agile UX and design thinking. To summarize, does it work? Yes, I believe it does. I think it's possible to balance those 2 workflows together. And if you think about them as a mindset, it really functions incredibly well under pace. If you help teams understand that there's a difference between design craft and design thinking, as designers, we're accountable for our craft and we promote design thinking where possible. And at HSBC, we've actually got a design education team that supports the rollout of customer-centric design thinking as a way of working and as a mindset, also in agile environments and other environments too. Continuous change, it's not going to go away as we move ever forward in this digital environment. Excuse me. Being able to constantly pivot and iterate is a way of life, and it needs to be included in design. So being able to sort of tweak the mindsets of designers that are just keen on perfection every time, I think it's important to encourage that space to feel that they can not get it right first time and keep trying. We often say, you know, fail fast, fail often, but we don't let people know when we do. So everybody understands, you know, bring everybody along on that journey to understand the journey that your team is on, I think is really important. And it's about, again, that clarity that comes from that agile methodology too. That was a really very quick tour sort of through agile UX and design thinking and my learns at least. Thank you very much. I'll leave you with the agile principle number 5 out of 12. Build projects around motivated individuals, give them the environment and the support that they need, and trust them to get the job done. And yeah, if you have your phones on you, you can have a look at these 3 links to what I've mentioned, the principles, the Design Council, and the Stanford Design School. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. That was awesome. That was, yeah. Yeah, if anyone has any questions for do submit them now. So Lisa, I think it's really interesting you kind of speaking on bringing these methods together and kind of the importance of kind of embedding that kind of in your both team and kind of organization's culture, and kind of team culture is something that's popped up kind of quite a lot over the last week of Interact Global, and it's kind of, you know, culture change is obviously kind of something that's definitely easier said than done. Could you speak kind of a little more on the challenges you faced when kind of developing this culture, and kind of any kind of tips on kind of where people should start? Yeah, I think it's ongoing. I think, you know, culture's constantly moving and changing, and especially in the last 18 months that we've had the challenges of remote working has really forced, I think, a lot of the way in which we think about communities, not just design communities, but you know, the way that we all work together. I've heard some, you know, really sorry, really sad experiences from some old colleagues from other teams across other brands and businesses, but also some really good, successful examples as well. And I think one pattern that I've sort of seen more recently is when you're thinking about if you're in an agile environment, say you're in a startup and there's that clear structure, you know, it's practically concrete, everybody's working towards it. It's very difficult just to suddenly slap design thinking straight over the top of it. So it's not going to work. But where I have seen it being quite successful is by breaking down that process, those stages, and inviting you know, small areas of the business or your groups into little stages of it. As I said, it's not a linear process, design thinking. It is completely non-linear, and by that logic, you can do a little bit of research and that will benefit you. You can do a little bit of prototyping and that will benefit you. You know, you don't need, it's not everything
all together all in once. If you can start encouraging, small baby steps into a current way of working, and then work on encouraging and celebrating the value that you might find from that, then you're on your way. It's about those small steps. And I think, not just at HSBC, but I've heard, a lot of teams that approach it from this respect, rather than just force it. We're all changing to this particular model. That doesn't work so much, and you'll end up having coming up against a lot of brick walls as teams start to protect themselves and protect their way of working. So small steps and understanding sort of that active listening of how you can actually assist each other. And last sort of point on that is the reverse of that, being able to encourage designers to actually understand their environment a bit better. So if you are, maybe a junior or middleweight, or maybe just new to a particular working environment, such as Agile, being able to let go and actually understand a bit more about that will help educate, your ways of working too. So it's kind of a synergy between each.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've got a question here from Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Paul asks, how far ahead of the dev sprints do you tend to do user research and then later design?
So I suppose it varies. I mean, some of the things that we're looking at researching now are due, or sort of programmatically due, in the first sort of quarter of next year, effectively. So we're working about sort of a quarter ahead. The sprints haven't been set up for those. The priorities may or may not change. Things like that might affect the research, but the fact that we're doing the research and we're actually looking at user motivation or particular testing means that we're not, we've experienced that stress of like having it right up against the sprints and not quite getting it right. So being able to stretch it out that much would, it's quite helpful. That might not always be possible. These pieces of research are quite chunky. They're going to take a few weeks. We were also running research that's sort of maybe only a month ahead of sort of that development time. So we're looking at sort of iterating on the tests that we're doing there. So that's more sort of user accessibility testing rather than sort of motivational pieces. And then in terms of design generally tries to sit just behind the dev sprints. So talking again about that cadence, it's really nice to be able to have an open discussion with teams where you can actually set up and understand what's going into the next sprint or the next 2-week sprints. So just having that space. But I think it really does depend on what speed a team feels comfortable working at. There's no sort of specific instruction. If you have very incredibly fast designers that are just, can work bish bash bosh, they know how to change and iterate something very quickly, then you might not need as much time because they're very fluid like that. But if you have a set of designers that want to take a bit more time for particular reasons, then you need the space. I hope that answers your question, Paul.
Awesome. Yeah. So we have the next question here from Zhao, who asks, how are developers involved in the discovery phase?
It's good to have developers in the discovery phase, especially in terms of being able to understand what is possible to build. I think there can be times when things get created, things get designed, and then you only realize sort of at the back end that it's not possible to build that, either because there's a skills gap or your particular team of developers might not know how to create such a thing and they don't have the time to go and work it out. So including a developer or a team, depending on how you're set up, earlier on when you're sort of starting to work on particular screens is quite important, I think. And it's good, again, it comes back to that relationship building so that you can be co-creating potentially with developers as well as product owners, so that they understand what you're trying to create, what you're trying to provide as an experience. I think that's really important. Yes.
Thank you. So I can't see any more questions, although There are lots of comments in the chat, just saying how much of a hero you are for presenting whilst under the weather. And yeah, and yeah, lots of praise for you there. We will be sharing this recording by the end of the week. And yeah, I'm sure if anyone has any kind of further questions, they can reach out to you on LinkedIn.
Yeah, always happy to have a chat and catch up. Really enjoy finding out what other people are working on across the world. Really cool.
Awesome, thank you, Lisa. Cool, thanks everyone that tuned in. Up next in just under 20 minutes, we have Liz Hubert and Diana Sonis of CX by Design with their talk, Forget the Trail of Breadcrumbs. There is still a little bit of time to sign up, so please do so if you haven't done already. And we'll see you back then. Lisa, again, thank you so much for your great presentation.
Thanks for having me.
And yeah, we will see you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks.